It gives me great pleasure now to welcome Michael Hall as our first keynote speaker. We're welcoming Michael back to the National Trust. Michael is a long-standing friend and supporter of the LGBTQ+ staff network. And Michael has worked extensively in the field of heritage and publications. Michael was architectural editor at Country Life magazine and then subsequently editor at two of the most seminal art historical periodicals, Apollo magazine and the Burlington magazine. Michael's also published widely on 19th century architecture and design, on country houses and the Gothic revival, and on the history of collecting. Today, Michael's talk is taken from his forthcoming book, A Queer Inheritance, Alternative Histories in the National Trust, which is coming out on the 5th of February, I believe, next year. And Michael will be sharing some of the research around a very particular moment in the National Trust's history, dating to about 1967-1970, where the issues of institutional renewal, which Sandy and Tina touched upon in their introductory words, and questions of homophobia collided together just at the moment when male homosexuality in this country was partially decriminalized. So a very, I think, apposite moment to be looking back to, given what's going on out there in the broader world, and the fact that the National Trust itself is going through this moment of institutional reflection and renewal. So, Michael, I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak today. It's an enormous privilege. One point I would just add to the introduction is that I have never worked for the National Trust. I do not speak in any way on its behalf, and this is not, my forthcoming book is not an official National Trust publication in any way. Obviously, lots of current employees of the National Trust and former ones have given me informal help because I've talked to them about their own memories and experiences within the National Trust. But this is very much an outsider's view, and I would emphasize that. And the other thing which I hope that people will take away is that they don't think, oh, well, the queer history of the National Trust has been done, so thank you, goodbye. It's an incredibly rich subject, and I think my book just skims the surface, really. So if people look at it, read it, and go away and think, I'd like to follow that up and do more research, I would encourage it very, very strongly. Now, do you think now is the moment it's going to... It's like, wait, no, right. Well, just so you can see, this is the contents page, which shows really, I hope, that the book has sort of two aspects. One is, it is about places, and I put on the screen the places that I'm going to be talking about in detail, which whenever I show it to people, they always almost immediately say, but you're not going to talk about X, or, oh, you've left out Y, that's really disappointing, but there you go. The two places perhaps to draw attention to, because one that may not be familiar to you, many of them, most of them will be, of course, is Piney Copse, and I'll be impressed if you know what that is if you don't work for the National Trust. But it's an area of woodland in the Surrey Hills, an area of outstanding natural beauty that was bequeathed to the National Trust by E.M. Forster. So it's a way of opening up the subject of queer landscapes, not just Piney Copse itself and the idea of the greenwood into which people, and specifically in Forster's eyes, gay men could retreat, but other places as well, seen through the sort of lens of Forster's writings. And then the other place you may feel, well, why bother to include it? Because, it's probably one of the most famous queer heritage places in the world, which is Sissinghurst. But oddly, when I looked at what's been written about Sissinghurst, particularly from a queer perspective, and a great deal has been written, people have tended to focus on the buildings and on the collections and Vita Sackville West's writing room and so on. People, funnily enough, don't really talk about the garden, which is the reason why people go there. So what I've tried to do in that chapter is explore, in particular, why you might think of a garden as a queer place. It's queer, the queer horticultural networks, for instance, that it opens up. But as I said, the book has two aspects, and the other one is to look at the National Trust as an institution. And I hope it will perhaps begin to address the question of why it's worth studying history at all, and not just the history of a heritage organisation, through a queer lens. Obviously, it's partly a question of uncovering hidden or concealed or neglected stories, and that's very, very important. But I think that's just a platform for allowing us to critique the organisations in particular through which we experience our material heritage. And by critique, I don't necessarily mean criticism, because I think one should look at the achievements of the National Trust in doing this over the century or more of its existence. And in this, although I talk quite a lot about the origins of the National Trust and misunderstandings about it, it was for most of its early years a deeply urban organisation in a way that I think people don't always grasp. It was founded almost at exactly the same time as the Oscar Wilde trials. It was deeply entwined with middle-class anxiety about particularly the working classes in cities. But in this talk, I'll be focusing on the conclusion, where, as has been said, I'll be discussing the upheavals in the National Trust in the 1950s and 1960s. Of course, the anticipation is terrible. You get to go off, you know. Oh, right. Oh, well, that's good. Yeah. No, it'll go off just at the moment I'm about to make a joke. I know that's the way it always works. So actually, the final chapters of the book take me back to how the book began. And we go back to 2017, when I was chatting to David Adshead, who was then the National Trust's head curator. And I made the point that people often misunderstand the early history of the National Trust's country house programme, how these houses came to the Trust. Because in the 30s and 40s, it wasn't really about indigent aristocrats trying to avoid tax bills. It was very much more to do with aesthetically minded bachelors looking for an organisation that would look after in perpetuity houses that they had created. Well, I think it was significant that that conversation took place in 2017, because, as many of you here will remember, of course, it was the moment when, to mark the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, the National Trust staged its nationwide programme Prejudice and Pride. And so I think that's how the idea of the book was born. Now, in 2017, I think it was much more obvious than it would be now that such a book would be written by a cisgender, gay, white man, and one not in his first youth either. And it's a reflection of the limitations of my own identity that I planned at first to write solely about the group of donors whom I've called the aesthete bachelors. But the research done by many people outside as well as inside the Trust, and in particular two of the leading scholars on queer heritage, Alison Oram and Matt Cook, who wrote the book that was published by the National Trust at the time of the 2017 programme, persuaded me that it was a very much bigger subject to be tackled. In the book, I've striven to achieve a reasonable balance of genders, with chapters focusing on, for example, Octavia Hill, Vita Sackville-West, Virginia Woolf, Edith Craig, and Lady Caroline Paget, for example. But in this talk, the focus will, I'm afraid, be overwhelmingly male, but that is part of its point, as its subject is an elite upper-class coterie, most of whom had been to public schools and had attended Oxford or Cambridge. And so I should warn you that most of the illustrations for the talk will be of middle-aged men in suits, but I would say that is not a fair reflection of the illustrations in my book. So who were these bachelor aesthetes that I've mentioned? So I'm just very quickly going to run through some examples. And I'm not going to talk about any of them in detail, because that's not my prime subject, but it does lead in to what the subject is in an important way. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the very first house given to the National Trust, complete with its contents, Treasurer's House in York, given by Frank Green, of Packwood in Warwickshire, and of Anglesey Abbey in Cambridgeshire. There's a substantial amount that can be said in general terms about the queer status of the bachelor in the interwar years. Up to the 1960s, lifelong bachelors were a fairly small minority in Britain. Of men born in 1930, for example, 81% had married by the time they were 30. But in particular terms, I was able to write about them only because of evidence provided by James Lees-Milne's diaries, as otherwise it's almost always the familiar story to anyone researching our queer past, the disappearance of documentary sources. Lord Fairhaven at Anglesey Abbey was succeeded on his death in 1966 by his brother, whose first act, according to his family, was to destroy the diary that Lord Fairhaven had kept throughout his life. As a result, we have to look to the collections at Anglesey Abbey as a basis for discussing Lord Fairhaven's homosexuality. A good example of a man for whom, so far as I'm aware, there are no papers throwing light on his private life, this man, let's go north to Lindisfarne Castle on Holy Island. Really, in some ways, you could say a sort of icon of the National Trust. Its history is well known. In 1902, when it was derelict, it was bought by the printer and publisher Edward Hudson, who commissioned the architect Edwin Lutyens to rebuild it as a holiday home. Hudson was the owner of the magazine Country Life, and the castle Lutyens designed for him is a photogenic masterpiece of the arts and crafts taste, promoted by the magazine, complete with a walled garden planted by Gertrude Jekyll. The result is so compelling that the route by which the National Trust came to acquire the castle is often forgotten. In 1921, Hudson sold it to a London stockbroker, Oswald Falk, from whom it was bought 8 years later by merchant banker Edward de Stuyne. De Stuyne's parents had moved to England from Antwerp, and he had become integrated into English upper-class society in a way familiar from the stories of other wealthy Jewish families who had converted to Christianity and settled in England in the 19th century, such as the Messels or Sassoons. In 1944, he offered Lindisfarne Castle as a gift to the National Trust with all its contents, primarily Hudson's collection of Old English oak furniture, which had been sold with the building. And so, in September 1945, James Lees-Milne paid a visit to de Stuyne at Lindisfarne on behalf of the National Trust's Historic Buildings Committee, for which he had been working since before the war. De Stuyne did not appeal to Lees-Milne, who wrote in his diary that he is a peppery, fussy, schoolmasterish little man with whom I should hate to have a row. Lees-Milne, as always, was curious about his host's domestic arrangements. De Stuyne was a bachelor who lived with an older unmarried sister Gladys, but she wasn't there when Lees-Milne visited. Instead, de Stuyne was accompanied by a much younger male friend. Lees-Milne seems not to have caught his name, but thought him rather nice, unlike de Stuyne, who, he wrote, is prudish and disapproving, yet he puts his arm around one's waist and makes rapid, sly remarks, which I think it best to leave unheeded. A queer, unmarried Jewish banker, de Stuyne is not the sort of donor usually associated with the National Trust, whose principal concern at the time Lees-Milne visited Lindisfarne was the future of the historic houses owned by the country's traditional land-owning classes. In response to lobbying about the threat to such houses from ever-declining agricultural revenue and ever-rising death duties, the National Trust secured an Act of Parliament in 1937 that allowed it to hold land and funds as endowments for the upkeep of its properties. This was designed to facilitate a plan. Families would give their houses and estates to the National Trust, which would open them to the public. The former owners would thus escape liability for capital taxes, while continuing to live in their houses. Lees-Milne was employed by the National Trust to encourage landowners to enter into such arrangements, but to begin with, he had very limited success. Few estates generated enough revenue to sustain a large historic house, and the National Trust was far too poor to support them from its own funds. In 1935, it had only 4,800 members. The intended solution was that landowners would hand over a large sum of money to form an endowment for the future upkeep of their houses, but this, understandably, was not popular. As a result, most of the houses acquired by the National Trust up to the end of the Second World War, as part of what it referred to as the Country Houses scheme, were relatively small and had been given by people rich enough to offer an endowment. By the late 1930s, the scheme was proving especially attractive to unmarried men who had bought small historic houses, which they remodeled, decorated, furnished with their collections, and very often enhanced with a garden, and now wished to see preserved in perpetuity. Such men, and those who made gifts of such houses to the National Trust in this period were all men, were part of a wider cultural phenomenon in 20th century England that has been called the cult of the manor house, an enthusiasm for buying and restoring small houses, ideally Tudor or Jacobean, that were believed to embody national identity in the form of a settled rural social order centred on the squirearchy. This was an ideal that Lees Mill embraced wholeheartedly. Yet it's one to which these bachelor donors stand at an angle in terms of class, since the money they brought to the task had usually been new minted in industry, banking, and commerce. Their unmarried, childless family circumstances may be one reason why Lees Mill was so ready to apply the term fake to their much restored houses, implying they were sexual as well as architectural impostors. Lees Mill's sensitivity to the effects of new owners on old houses was shaped by his childhood in the heavily restored, half-timbered Tudor Wickhamford Manor, Worcestershire, which had been bought in 1906 by his father, with money made in the family's cotton business in Oldham, Lancashire. By the time he joined the National Trust in March 1936, Lees Mill was 27, and in terms of his career had been at a loose end ever since leaving Oxford 5 years before. He was rescued by the queer network centred on one of his mentors, the author and diplomat Harold Nicolson, with whom he'd been having an affair since 1933. Nicholson had been told that there was a job at the National Trust working with historic buildings. He was told that by his wife, Vita Sackville-West, who had been asked by her lover, Hilda Matheson, director of talks at the BBC, and I show you on the screen, whether she knew of anyone who might be suitable for this new post. Matheson was well informed about the National Trust, as her brother, Donald MacLeod Matheson, had since 1934 been its chief executive, a post then known as secretary. It was still a tiny organisation run largely by volunteers, with only 2 salaried staff and some clerical assistants. Lees Mill's career at the National Trust was interrupted by a brief period in the army, and after being invalided out in 1942, he began his published diaries, which for this period run only to the end of 1949, a year before he resigned. When he'd been in the army, the National Trust had appointed as assistant to MacLeod Matheson the man who would be Lees Mill's closest companion in his work for the Historic Buildings Committee, Eardley Knollys. The son of a Hampshire land agent, Knollys had spent time in Hollywood in an unsuccessful bid to become a screenwriter, and in the south of France, where he had an affair with Jean Cocteau. He set up in London as a dealer in avant-garde contemporary art with his lover, a younger painter named Frank Coombs, who in April 1942, just after Knollys had started work at the National Trust, was killed in an air raid in Belfast. Lees Mill took a little time to warm to Knollys, who was a left-wing atheist with advanced tastes in art, but it was to be a fruitful meeting of opposites. A shared sense of humour and complete openness about their sexuality to each other proved the basis of an enduring friendship, helped by the fact that they said neither had a physical interest in the other. By this point, the Country Houses scheme was rapidly gathering impetus, thanks in part to the leadership of Oliver Brett, 3rd Viscount Esher, who had been chairman of the Trust's Historic Buildings Committee since 1936. Described by Lees Mill as like a dormouse, small, hunched, quizzical, sharp, and cynical, he had married an American heiress, absolving him from the need to earn a living. Instead, he devoted himself to voluntary work for charities, including the National Trust, with whom he formed a close bond with Lees Mill, who wrote that, with infinite merriment, he always got what he wanted, and what he wanted was invariably right. There was, however, a sharp edge to Esher's tongue that could occasionally be hurtful to junior colleagues, and it was associated with an aesthetic elitism that Lees Mill relished. "He was a most loyal boss," wrote Lees-Mill, "and a friend who supported me through thick and thin in whatever argument or tiff I might be engaged in with what he termed the mangle-wurzels of this world." Now, with the election of the second Marquess of Zetland as chairman of the Executive Committee in 1932, there was a marked increase in the number of landowners involved in running the National Trust. In 1945, Zetland was succeeded by David Lindsay, 28th Earl of Crawford and Balcarres, one of the great post-war public servants of the arts, who was to remain in post for 20 years. Lord Crawford was reluctant to leave his Scottish home, Balcarres, more than once a month. That gave greater freedom and responsibility to the Trust's chief executive, the secretary. But largely because of the level of salary on offer, the post was difficult to fill. And after MacLeod Matheson retired in 1945, a long-term replacement for him wasn't found for another 4 years. In 1946, the job was given to a former Vice Admiral, Oliver Bevier, whose breezy naval manner did not go down well. Lees-Mill told Isha that the new secretary was a nice Philistine, well thinking he was neither nice nor qualified for the job. That Bevier was not equipped to deal with the National Trust's intersections of class and sexuality was made embarrassingly evident when in December 1946, he and Lees-Mill spent a night at Buscott Park, Oxfordshire. They were guests of Gavin Henderson, second Lord Farringdon, who was thinking of disposing of his house and its estate. After Eton and Oxford, where he had plunged into the antics of the bright young things, and an unhappy but short-lived marriage, he had inherited Buscott from his financier grandfather, the first Lord Farringdon, in 1934. Rich, camply debonair, and unabashedly gay, he was an unlikely recruit to left-wing politics. But in the House of Lords, Farringdon took the Labour whip and became deeply involved in the Council for Civil Liberties and the Fabian Society. Homophobia helped keep him out of the post-war Labour government. He was described by Lord Winster, the Minister for Civil Aviation, as a pansy pacifist of whose private tendencies it might be slander to speak. Buscott was a relatively small Georgian house that had been aggrandised in the 1850s. The new Lord Farringdon reduced its impressive art collection by selling the unfashionable Victorian paintings, with the major exception of Burne-Jones's Briar Rose cycle, and Lord Leighton's strikingly homoerotic Daedalus and Icarus, and demolished the house's 19th century editions. Thanks to his architect, Geddes Hislop, known as Paul, a gay man whose partner was the writer Raymond Mortimer, a former lover of Harold Nicholson's. You can see how these networks work. The result was a house of greater classical elegance and presence than it can originally have possessed. Characteristically, Lees-Mill thought it a well-contrived fake. Lees-Mill was on first-name terms with Farringdon and knew what to expect at Buscott. Alert as ever to queer elements in a household, he noted that Gavin has a youngish, ogling, rather raddled American staying, or perhaps living with him. This was Kenneth Harris, later an antiques dealer in Chicago, who was Farringdon's partner from 1944 until the mid-1960s. Lees-Mill wrote in his diaries, "Poor Admiral Bevier more bewildered than ever by the company, his incredulous eyes on stalks, his instincts offended." Their departure the next morning was delayed by Lees-Mill's car refusing to start, even with the help of Farringdon's chauffeur, who, wrote Lees-Mill, looks more like a Shaftesbury Avenue sissy than a skilled mechanic. By the time the National Trust took possession of the estate in 1955, Admiral Bevier was long gone, having retired after little more than 2 years, no doubt with relief. Lees-Mill had also given up full-time work for the Trust, since in 1951, to the surprise of many of his friends, he had married a wealthy divorced woman, Elvilda Chaplin, who for tax reasons lived for part of every year in the south of France. He retained a strong link with his former colleagues, however, through his appointment as a part-time advisor to the Historic Buildings Committee. He got on well with his successor as secretary to the committee, Robin Fedden. Although they were very different in some ways, Fedden was very athletic, as his photograph perhaps suggests. He was a dedicated mountaineer and had a reputation as a womanizer, a result in part of the lesbian preferences of his wife Renée. They were similar in their combination of charm and determination. The new secretary of the Trust was also a contrast with his predecessor. This was Jack Rathbone, a key person in the story I'm going to tell, but I've been unable to find a photograph of him anywhere. Rathbone was a solicitor whose name had been put forward for the job by Eardley Knollys. Lees Mill, who remembered him from Oxford, supported the appointment, although he noted Rathbone's eagerness to be liked. If he only knew, he has no need to try so hard. This quality may have sprung from an underlying nervous uncertainty in his personality that would come to the fore in a crisis, and was probably connected to his firmly closeted homosexuality. Lees Mill was discreet about this in his diaries, probably because Rathbone was still alive when they were published. By the time of Rathbone's appointment, it was recognized that the National Trust's historic buildings needed a more professional approach to their care and arrangement. During the war, there had been a devolution of responsibility for the Trust's land holdings to 9 regional agents who answered to the chief agent based in London. In 1947, Rathbone created a parallel management team known as area representatives of men, and they were all men, qualified to make aesthetic decisions about buildings and collections. In his diary, Lees Mill claimed credit for this idea, but he'd been prompted by Lord Esher, who disliked any suggestion that the agents might decide artistic or architectural matters. After all, Lees Mill, he said, you must remember, they're only plumbers. The representatives were answerable to Lees Mill as historic building secretary, but the absence of any defined formal relationship with the agents was from the outset both problematic in practical terms and damaging in terms of the culture of the organization. There was a suspicion that some of the representatives followed Esher's lead in looking down on the agents, and as a result, in the words of Jennifer Jenkins in the Trust's centenary history, there developed a schism between the agents, known as Manglewurzels, and the representatives, the lilies of the field, with divisive consequences for the future. There was an overlap between the queer coteries in which Lees Mill was at home and his professional colleagues. Not all the representatives were paid posts. Some of them were honorary, and 3 of the honorary representatives he chose were country house owners who fell comfortably into the category of bachelor aesthetes. Wyndham Ketton Creamer at Felbrigg Hall, Norfolk, Sir Giles Isham at Lamport Hall, Northamptonshire, and Miles Hildyard at Flintham Hall, Nottinghamshire. And in the case of the last 2, their sexuality was an open secret. Lees Mill's experience in trying to bring order to the contents of the large houses that were beginning to come to the National Trust, such as Stour Head, had prompted him to seek help from experts, some of whom were to assume a more formal role as honorary advisors to the Trust. These included the pioneering historian of furniture and interiors, Margaret Jourdain, who lived with the novelist Ivy Compton Burnett, both good friends of Lees Mill, the shamelessly homosexual bibliophile Bob Gaythorne Hardy, whose sister, Anne, had briefly been engaged to Lees Mill in the 1930s. And it was in addition, thanks to Knollys and Lees Mill, that Paul Hislop, who we saw earlier at Buscott, was given a string of minor architectural commissions by the Trust. But the advisor who had the most influence on the Trust's houses was the interior decorator John Fowler, a partner in the Mayfair firm Colfax and Fowler, which, thanks to him, had a high reputation for decorating country houses with flair and imagination and sensitivity to the historical context. Recognizing that he could help the National Trust with the particular problem of large houses that had been acquired in poor decorative condition and with few or no historic contents, Lees Mill suggested that Fowler be employed to decorate Claydon House, Buckinghamshire, which had been given in 1956 by the Verney family. Fowler, who was dictatorial by nature and disliked working with committees, soon worked how to get his own way by camp force of personality. The existence of this queer network might have aroused more hostility within the National Trust had it not been necessarily discreet. Some ignored it or were oblivious. Others were, like Lord Esher, sufficiently men of the world not to care. A major exception to such tolerance was the chairman himself, Lord Crawford, an undoubted lily, but also homophobic. Staying at a hotel in Paris, he was taken aback to encounter Lees Mill sharing a bedroom with a junior male member of staff. "Doubling up, I see," he remarked dryly. when, in a meeting at which Lees Milne was present, there was a discussion about involving Princess Margaret's new husband, the Earl of Snowdon, in the work of the National Trust, Crawford declared that he wanted nothing to do with buggers. If he was in fact oblivious to the presence of buggers in the organisation, he was one of the few people at the Trust's head office unaware of a recent scandal initiated by Lees Milne's wife, Alvilda. She was, like her husband, bisexual, with a preference for her own sex. And in 1953, she embarked on an affair with Vita Sackville-West. Although she struck most people as more than capable of looking after herself, she had an underlying emotional neediness that was evident in the distress she felt when, in 1957, Sackville-West abruptly ended the relationship. When the following year Alvilda discovered that her husband had himself embarked on an affair, she was overcome with jealous rage. Lees Milne had been asked by Harold Nicholson whether he might find a job for a young protégé, John Kenworthy Brown, who accordingly was appointed representative for the Wessex and Severn region. Lees Milne was enchanted by him, and although the physical side of the relationship seems to have been comparatively unimportant for them both, felt that he had met his soulmate. When Alvilda discovered what was going on, she pursued the lovers with vengeful fury, steaming open Kenworthy Brown's letters to her husband and complaining bitterly about Lees Milne's behaviour to anyone who might listen. After he had stood up to his wife, reminding her that he had tolerated her affair with Vita Sackville-West, she marched into Rathbone's office and demanded that Kenworthy Brown be sacked. Rathbone naturally refused, but he was shaken by the incident, fearing that it might come to the ears of Lord Crawford. Alvilda began to back down only after a strong reprimand from Vita, but it took several years for the marriage to recover, to the point that in 1966, Lees Milne felt able to resign from the National Trust in favour of life as a full-time writer. His regret at leaving the organisation after 30 years was tempered by relief that he wasn't directly involved in the upheavals it was then undergoing, which broke up the queer network of which he had been such a key part. On the 23rd of April 1965, 1,000 beacons of bonfires were lit on high points along the coasts of England, Wales and Northern Ireland to launch the National Trust's Project Neptune, an appeal to raise £2 million over the next 2 years for the acquisition of unspoiled coastline. The project had been conceived by the Trust's then chief agent, Christopher Gibbs, whose concern for saving coastland went back to the 1930s. His idea was enthusiastically supported by Sir John Smith, who in 1960 had succeeded Lord Esher as chair of the General Purposes Committee. A member of one of Britain's wealthiest banking dynasties, Smith had a strong interest in historic architecture. He considered becoming an architect before deciding to settle down, get married and join the family bank, and had become a member of the Historic Buildings Committee in 1952, when still only 29. He was bursting with ideas for revitalising the organisation and was successful in getting it to broaden its acquisitions of historic buildings away from country houses to include, for example, industrial archaeology. These ambitions led to friction with Rathbone. Smith undoubtedly could be both relentless and unforgiving, and he made little secret of the fact that he thought the Trust was being run in an amateurish way and that Rathbone was effete and obstructive. In April 1964, Rathbone had a nervous breakdown. When, partly in consequence, Smith resigned as chair of the General Purposes Committee the following month, he bequeathed a time bomb in the form of the newly appointed director of Project Neptune, the retired naval commander Conrad Rawnsley. Even though his principal qualification for the post was that he was the grandson of Hardwicke Rawnsley, one of the National Trust's founders, Rawnsley had until now shown such little interest in the organisation that he wasn't even a member. He was quick, however, to form strong opinions about it when his ambitious and expensive schemes for running Project Neptune began to meet resistance from Rathbone and others, who soon realised that he'd been granted far too much independence. When in November 1966 he was given 5 months' notice, Rawnsley's formidable energy, which had persuaded Smith to support his appointment against Rathbone's better judgment, was turned against his former employer. As John Gaze, later the Trust's chief agent and author of a very useful history of the National Trust, as Gaze recalled, in private, Rawnsley could be lively, engaging, light-hearted, but if he's speaking in public, his voice and demeanour take on the aspect of an Old Testament prophet, and he is as unforgiving as Jehovah. In the campaign he embarked upon to reform the National Trust, Rawnsley demonstrated the truth of Gaze's words, and, like Jehovah, he was particularly unforgiving to the sins of the cities of the plain. Rawnsley's main complaint about the National Trust was that it had treated him and Project Neptune badly, but he leveraged public support by attacking what he regarded as its excessive focus on country houses, claiming that it promoted a snob attitude and a tuft hunting attitude. In private, he asserted that the country houses scheme was run by a queer aristocratic cabal, a belief that rankled with him for many years. When he was interviewed by Paula Weidiger for her book Gilding the Acorn, Behind the Facade of the National Trust, published in 1994 in the run-up to the Trust's centenary, Rawnsley blamed Robin Fedden, who knew, he said, that I deplored the strong homosexual element which he had introduced. He recruited entirely homosexuals as representatives. He built up his own little organisation of chaps to look after the upholstery and the curtains and the carpets and the interior decoration of the houses. They had no qualifications apart from their artistic inclinations. The way that Rawnsley seized on this topic may suggest that he was aware of the gossip provoked by Alvilda Lees Milne's behaviour, without being clear about her husband's role in creating that organisation of chaps, and pointed to Fedden simply because he was then the chair of the Historic Buildings Committee, with which Rawnsley kind of had very few direct dealings. Rawnsley then set up a members' movement for the reform of the National Trust to press for change. At an extraordinary general meeting in February 1967, he vigorously attacked the organisation, claiming it was run by a ruling hierarchy which lacks the common touch and is remote from the people, and didn't do enough to encourage public participation and access. The motions put forward by the members' movement were defeated, partly because Rawnsley's hectoring manner worked against him. But although he had lost the battle, the National Trust was compelled to acknowledge the force of many of his criticisms. In July 1967, an independent committee of inquiry, chaired by a distinguished chartered accountant, Sir Henry Benson, later Lord Benson, was set up by the National Trust to make recommendations for reform. Benson interviewed a number of witnesses, and he wrote later in his memoirs that he much enjoyed this task, but was wearied by Rawnsley, who was convinced, Benson said, that the Trust employed some homosexuals on its staff, and he caused much distress and irritation by making innuendos to that effect in various places. He eventually came to give evidence to the committee. At the end of a long and tiresome meeting, I said spontaneously and with conviction that I was sorry I couldn't help him because I'd never been able to detect a homosexual from a heterosexual. There was nothing more to be said, and his campaign petered out soon afterwards. Rawnsley was probably not much more homophobic than the average man of his age and background, and the link he made between a supposed aristocratic cabal and covert sexuality was nothing new. In the late 19th century, radical opponents of inherited privilege had exploited scandals, such as the Oscar Wilde trials, to assert that male homosexuality was a vice of the decadent upper classes. Echoes of such attitudes were evident in the two prosecutions brought against Lord Montague of Beaulieu in 1953-54, which resulted in his imprisonment for consensual sexual relationships with two RAF servicemen. There were also topical reasons why the subject might have been at the forefront of Rawnsley's mind. In particular, the extensive discussions about homosexuality in the press and Parliament between the publication of the Wolfenden Report in 1957 and the legislation that put its recommendations into effect with the passage of the Sexual Offences Act in 1967. An association of what was becoming to be known as the establishment with homosexuality was reinforced by the spy scandals of the 1950s and 1960s, and in particular the trial in 1962 of an Admiralty official, William Vassall, for passing secrets to the Russians after, he claimed, he had been snared in a KGB homosexual honey trap in Moscow in 1954. It was fortunate for Lees Milne that few were aware of his friendship with another notorious gay spy, Guy Burgess. They had met as a result of Burgess's close friendship, and for a time more, with Harold Nicolson, who was deeply shaken by Burgess's defection to the Soviet Union in 1951. Nicholson, who had become a member of the National Trust's executive committee during the war and would become its vice chairman, was one of the very few to know that another gay man, the art historian Anthony Blunt, who had been the Trust's honorary pictures advisor since 1948, had been a Soviet spy, a fact not made public until 1979. A number of the Trust's employees interviewed by the Benson Committee emphasized the rift between the agents and representatives. Rathbone was firm. Agents, he said, do not have much taste. And he was backed up by the Earl of Antrim, who had replaced Crawford as chairman in 1965. In all matters, said Antrim, efficiency and the hob-nailed boot should not take precedent over aesthetic considerations. Others, most vocally Rawnsley, took the view that the countryside deserved more of the attention being lavished on the country houses. When, after long discussions about the Benson report, the Executive Committee drew up its final recommendations for change, it opted for a new and simpler chain of command on the basis that agents and representatives should not have equal status and that the former should be in charge. Now, this change was a defeat for much of what Rathbone, Esher, and Lees Milne had stood for, but by then all had left the Trust. Soon after the extraordinary general meeting, Rathbone had another nervous breakdown. It was clear he lacked the personality or experience for leading the major campaign of modernisation and growth on which the organisation was about to embark. And so in 1968, Lord Antrim told him that he ought to resign. Having devoted himself to the organisation for 20 years, he was distraught. You see, he said, I have no wife or children, and the Trust is my family. One legacy of Rawnsley's assault on the National Trust was a greater willingness of its detractors to express their objections in public. One type of critic was guaranteed a public hearing should they wish it. At its outset, the country houses scheme, as I have mentioned, had been intended to keep families in place. In the minority of cases where this was achieved in the long term, there was inevitably occasional friction between the National Trust and families who now found themselves tenants in their own former homes. Even some who had moved out were ready to publicise their unhappiness with changes made to the National Trust to the estates, houses or gardens that they had previously owned. For example, when in 1967 Sudbury Hall, Derbyshire, was acquired from the Vernon family in lieu of death duties, the National Trust undertook a comprehensive scheme of redecoration of its bare, neglected interiors with advice from John Fowler. This included painting the exceptionally splendid carved 17th century staircase white after it had been brown for a century. The 10th Lord Vernon led a campaign of criticism of a change that dramatically emphasised his family's loss of authority in their former home. One of his friends who had stayed at Sudbury while it was still a private house objected in the pages of Country Life that the staircase was very vigorous joiner work on a grand scale, not at all feminine. Now it's been unsexed. It's pretty. This was barbed, since it could be read as implying that the aesthetic preferences of generations of heterosexual Vernons have been displaced, castrated even, by those of a queer bachelor and his supporters. The recommendations of the Benson report initiated or accelerated the development of what are now familiar aspects of the National Trust, from the professionalisation along museum lines of curatorship, conservation and research, to the commercial enterprises of shops and cafes. Although when in 1985 Jennifer Jenkins became the first woman to be chair of the executive committee, she was struck by how hierarchical and, in her words, male-orientated the organisation still seemed. She was, until the 1980s, all the senior executives were men. The extent of the change since then is indicated by the fact that the 3 successive Director Generals since 2001 have all been women. In 1965, when the Trust had just over 157,000 members, it would have seemed astonishing that its membership might be numbered in the millions, but also that its visitor figures would be in the hundreds of thousands. In the past half-century, the relationship between the lilies and the hob-nailed boots within the National Trust has been bound up with the unexpected and much debated phenomenon that such figures reflect, the rise in public enthusiasm for country houses. The idea that these buildings, with their landscapes, gardens, and collections, might be admired as a crowning achievement of British culture has long roots, but was given a fillip in the 1970s with the anxiety about their future that had long been a concern for a small coterie, became a matter of national concern, expressed most forcibly in a very famous exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Destruction of the Country House, 1875 to 1975. The democratization of this interest, evident also in the popularity of the country house look in interior decoration, as well as country house settings for historical dramas and so on, led not only to a huge increase in the number of visitors to country houses and consequent major upswing in people joining the National Trust, but also a new willingness in government to help preserve them. An important consequence was the launch in 1980 of the National Heritage Memorial Fund, which until the establishment of the National Lottery in 1994, played a central role in funding the preservation of historic houses and their contents. One of its first big cases was helping to preserve Canons Ashby, a poetically beautiful 17th century house in Northamptonshire. Its neglected condition had come to the National Trust's attention thanks to Jervis Jackson Stotts, who had been its historic buildings advisor since 1975. He lived nearby and he discovered the house when exploring the area on bicycle during school holidays. Some of you here will remember Jervis, I do, and his combination of scholarship, literary flair, and a champagne personality helped galvanize enthusiasm for the National Trust acquisition over the next decade of not just Canons Ashby, but also two other houses in apparently terminal decline, Colk Abbey, Derbyshire, and Jacobean Chastleton, Oxfordshire. In 1985, the energy and excitement that surrounded these initiatives resounded on the far side of the Atlantic, when the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. mounted the Treasure Houses of Britain, 500 years of private patronage and art collecting, a spectacular exhibition of over 700 works of art curated by Jackson Stotts, to which the National Trust was the largest single lender. By the time of the exhibition, the existence of what was becoming known as the cult of the country house was beginning to draw criticism from historians and cultural critics, who argued that it was an expression of a nostalgic and deferential heritage industry in which the National Trust had become bound up through its pursuit since the 1930s of country houses. By the mid-1990s, this view was finding an echo within the organization. In her centenary history, Jennifer Jenkins wrote, quoting the historian David Cannadine, that, she said, "The accusation that the Trust has promoted and been a beneficiary of the romantic, deferential and fictional approach to the country house is not without a grain of truth." The sense of a turning of the tide was reinforced by the death of Jackson Stotts in 1995 from an AIDS-related illness at the age of only 48. Leesmore wrote in his diary that he was distressed at the loss of this dear little, extremely clever, gifted, jolly aesthete with his incomparable knowledge, this tremendous asset to the NT, while adding, "A pity he was so camp and allowed his awful queer layabout friends to sponge off him." Such hostility, encouraged perhaps by the negative treatment in the press of homosexuality during the AIDS crisis, reflects the gulf between the attitudes of an older generation of queer men, trained by necessity in discretion, and the growing assertiveness of gay and lesbian identities by men and women who had grown up since 1967. During the 20 years between Leesmore's death in 1997 and Prejudice and Pride, those identities became visible within the National Trust to a degree that would have astonished him. This was in part a response to a growing enthusiasm among both scholars and the public for understanding country houses as documents of social and family history, not only as architectural and artistic monuments. For example, when it acquired Colk Abbey in 1985, the National Trust decided to preserve it as far as possible in its state of advanced decay, so documenting the decline of this large neoclassical house and the Harper Crewe family in the 20th century. Although the National Trust didn't make much, if anything, of the fact that the house's last private owner was a bachelor, This new imaginative flexibility towards the interpretation of its houses was the basis for a much greater curiosity and openness about the lives of their owners and families, based on a new acknowledgement of the diversity of visitors' interests and priorities. Yet as far as the National Trust's queer heritage was concerned, there was often a gap between what was known publicly about a place and the information provided to visitors who were drawn to it because of its queer history. Although, for example, Sissinghurst began to attract a large number of lesbian visitors following the publication of Nigel Nicholson's book about his parents, Portrait of a Marriage, in 1973, and Victoria Glendinning's biography of Vita Sackville-West 10 years later, no National Trust publication, including Nicholson's own much reprinted guidebook, nor any other form of interpretation at Sissinghurst, mentioned its creator's same-sex affairs until 2008. That dissonance is an issue more generally for the relationship between the tangible and intangible heritage of a place, since the meaning of a place for a queer audience is not necessarily visibly evident. Advances have been made in bringing such significance to public attention, for example, by seeking to have buildings listed for their historic queer associations. In 2008, the National Trust accepted the gift of Bucks Mill Cabin, a tiny cottage overlooking Bideford Bay on the North Devon coast, which it uses to host residences for artists. In 2017, the building was listed by English Heritage at Grade 2 for 3 reasons. For its architectural interest as a rare little altered mid-19th century fisherman's store, for its visual value as part of a group of listed buildings, and principally, the historic interest of its association with Judith Ackland and Mary Stella Edwards, artists and devoted lifelong companions who used the building as a studio and summer cottage from 1924 until Judith's death in 1971. Now, the phrase devoted lifelong companions may sound to many like a euphemistic way of describing the relationship, but it acknowledges the couple's own wishes. In 1973, Edwards wrote that there is no label that could enclose all the kinds of love we felt for each other. Such a rejection of labels, so familiar to anyone studying queer history, reflects the taboos, and in the case of men, the legal penalties, that for centuries hedged such relationships with thorns. There was a change in the United Kingdom with the legislation that converted the idea of queer marriage from metaphor to legal reality. One result is a new clarity about the way the relationships of same-sex couples can be publicly described. When one of the greatest post-war benefactors of the National Trust, Simon Sainsbury, died in 2006, there was no hesitation in acknowledging that he'd been in a civil partnership with his partner of 40 years, Stuart Grimshaw, nor would he have wished anything else, despite his very strong dislike of publicity. In 1972, he and Grimshaw took a lease of an 18th century house at Woolvedding near Midhurst in West Sussex, on an estate that had been owned by the National Trust since 1957. This gave them the opportunity to create an ambitious garden. Open to the public for the first time in 2010, Woolbedding Gardens are now a monument to not only the creativity and philanthropy of Sainsbury and Grimshaw, but also the new visibility of queer lives within the National Trust. To conclude, what general conclusions can be made about the value of studying the history and activities of the National Trust through a queer lens? There's a lot that can be said, but there are perhaps 2 of particular significance I'd like to mention now. First, queer studies are predicated on opposition to binaries, most obviously between homosexuality and heterosexuality, and between concepts of feminine and masculine. The antagonism between lilies and boots, or mangel wurzels if you prefer, is just such a binary between a booted figure conceptualized as male and heterosexual, and the lily who takes the form of an effeminate queer aesthete. Although the binary was fostered by the aesthetes as much as anyone, it was encouraged by an antagonism that took on an unequivocally homophobic character in the 1960s. The origins of that in the conflict of authority between the agents and the representatives is a consequence of a fundamental binary that is evident in the very name, the National Trust for Places of Historic Interest or Natural Beauty. From the mid-20th century, The pendulum to an outsider seems to have swung between these two focuses of its work, history, buildings and art on the one hand, and the natural world on the other. With the country houses scheme in the 1930s, the pendulum swung towards the former. From the 1990s onwards, it has swung firmly, I think, in the opposite direction. Yet a rejection of binaries encourages, by contrast, the idea that rather being opposed to each other, these are aspects of the same ideal. It's often argued that if the priorities of its founders are taken into account, the National Trust should be regarded as essentially a nature conservation charity. But they in fact sought to create something of much more complex and challenging significance, rooted in a belief in the spiritual power of that currently deeply unfashionable concept, beauty. So it was good to hear it mentioned at the beginning of today. It's simply not true that the beginning of the acquisition of country houses in the 1930s was a deviation from the National Trust's founding principles. The current Director General, Hilary McGrady, said earlier this year in an interview in The Times that we are more generally known for our houses, but the Trust was founded to give access to nature. Yet for the founder who is best remembered today, the housing reformer Octavia Hill, her life's mission began when, she said, she learned first to love nature and art, second to care that all should love nature and art, and third to see how to help them to do so. Second, it's possible to argue that one reason why the country houses scheme seemed for so long such a rich development of the National Trust's original work in acquiring land and buildings of historic interest is that country houses themselves elide the binaries by being in the most complete form an ensemble of landscape and estate and park with architecture, art and horticulture. Unease about the central role that such houses have come to play in perceptions of the National Trust was bound up with the belief that they perpetuate an obsolete deference to landed power, to which a queer critique would add that they are monuments to heteronormativity, since their very existence was founded on conventional ideas of family and inheritance. In both cases, however, I think that such arguments focus unduly on what the National Trust is held to represent, rather than what it actually does. As the late Lord Vernon was forced to acknowledge when contemplating the redecoration of Sudbury Hall by John Fowler, it takes land, buildings, and works of art out of family ownership and severs lines of inheritance in perpetuity. This implacable reality is usually taken for granted, so very great is the benefit to the public realm. But the more it's thought about, the more queer does it seem.